everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I'm Brenna Jean, and today we are going to talk about preparing for your medical school interview. Let's get started. All right, so the thing to remember about medical school interviews should be pretty obvious. They all do it a little bit differently. Now, in my case, I was invited to 8 interviews, but I only attended 4. So I'll speak to my experiences of those 4. Just always know it's important to do your own research on how the school structures their interview day. Generally speaking, interviews are either open file or closed file. So in my case, all of my interviews were open file, which means that my interviewers had access to all or parts of my application before I got there. So that was actually kind of nice because I didn't have to explain as much context about some of the stuff that I did, and they were able to ask more personalized questions about my experiences that made the interviews feel a lot more conversational. Now, if you are in a closed file interview, then just be prepared to give that little type of elevator pitch about yourself, kind of the 2-second download of this is who I am, this is why I like medical school, this is something notable about me, because that can help provide some context to the interviewer during your session. In my interviews, I always encountered typically 30-minute long interview sessions. I never had any multiple mini interview type situations to encounter. Honestly, I could have done the same preparation for both. It's just the amount of time that you have to talk. The great thing about 30-minute long interviews is you might be really nervous at the beginning, but by the end you're kind of like, oh yeah, I got this. From a scheduling standpoint, I would always expect to be there for a good portion of the day. In my case, most of my interviews started anywhere between 8 and 9 a.m. and I was typically out by like 2 or 3 o'clock, except for one of them where I got out at 4, and that was my first one, and I'll tell you about that story in another video. So in general, expect to be there for about 5 to 6 hours. Typically, most schools, they'll do their interviews in the morning. I did do one that was in the afternoon, and I was just nervous the entire day, and it was awful. Most schools also won't send you a detailed schedule beforehand, but you can always ask other people who went to those interviews or try and look online. They might post something online that could be helpful to give you kind of an idea of what the day will look like. Typically speaking, on the interview day itself, you will not only interview, you'll also get some more information on the school, what to do if you get accepted, kind of a download on their stats and their curriculum and that sort of thing from a very high level. You might get a financial aid presentation from one of their financial aid people. You might get a student affairs presentation of the different organizations they have on campus. You will always have an opportunity to talk to students, whether that be during the campus tour or over lunch. So that's always great because you get that student perspective of what the school is like, in addition to the more administrative or professor perspective on what the school is like. All right, so beyond the logistics of the interview, you also want to have done your research. So there's quite a few different things that you can be looking at for different schools. I'll tell you a little bit more about the things that I focused on and why I focused on them. So first, I just did the basic research on stats. So, what is their residency placement rate? What is the average GPA and MCAT that gets accepted here? What are their first-time pass rates on all levels of either the USMLE or the COMLEX exams? When it comes to stats, though, take all the stats with a grain of salt. A lot of schools are very kind of all up there as far as rates, like they're all, 95, 96, 97. If you see one who's like 91% on something, then I might be a little concerned. But the fact is they're all schools, they're all accredited, you're gonna get a good education. So, just take it with a grain of salt and use it later in the decision-making process. So another thing that I looked at a lot was just a preview of the facilities. So is it one building? Is it a few buildings? Do they have partnerships with other campuses? Do they have workout facilities? What do their OMM areas look like? What do their anatomy labs look like? Just look at the facilities and understand what's important to you about those facilities. One thing I always asked was, where do students work out? Because maintaining that good fitness routine is going to be really important to me in medical school, and if they have something right there on campus, then that's a lot easier than having to go down the street or find your own place. Another big thing for me was their curriculum and coursework. So I always tried to find something really special about their coursework, maybe a specific class that they did or a specific program that they do to get students more clinically engaged, because that can always be fun to ask about or point out, and it just shows that you really know what their curriculum looks like. In conjunction with that, schools teach things differently. So if you know that you're someone who works really well in case-based learning and they only do like 2 or 3 case-based things a semester, then ask about that. Ask if that seems to impact student learning. Same thing with lecture. If you love lectures, but you like watching them at home, ask about the attendance. So do you have to be there for every single class, or can you watch them later from home? Like I said, people work differently, so understand their structure to curriculum so that you can ask the questions to make sure that you can really see yourself succeeding there. Beyond the curriculum, rotations are another big thing. I mean, that's 2 years of your medical education is getting that clinical exposure through rotations. So understanding, where are the different hospitals that you could be placed at? What are the experiences of students at those hospitals? How is it determined where you're going to go? Also ask about audition rotations and how students are supported, or at least try and see what research you can find online. Audition rotations are really important for getting a good residency, and so having support in getting access to the rotation locations that you want to go to can really make or break your clinical experience in your 4th year. And finally, miscellaneous. So if there's different things that I haven't mentioned that are really important to you, make sure to do your research on that. I did a lot of research on global health initiatives within the school. So do they have standalone clinics in other areas of the world that they go to frequently? Do they do mission trips? When do they do them? How much do they cost? Do they do international rotations? And what are the limitations on those? All really important things if I want to travel abroad and see what medicine is like abroad, which I do. Another thing I looked at was clinical exposure in your 1st and 2nd years, because practice makes perfect, right? So things like sponsoring a clinic, maybe students go there once a week and get to write soap notes and shadow the doctors, or same thing with mobile clinics. Do they have a mobile clinic that students can volunteer at to get out into the community? So these are all things that were really important to me because getting that extra clinical exposure is so important. Oh, and I can't forget, the final thing you should research is yourself. By the time you get your interview invite, it might have been a few weeks since you looked at your application. Before your interview, review your application, and not just your general application, but also your supplemental application to that school. Especially if it's an open file type interview, you want to be really well versed in the things that you said in your personal statement or the activities that you've done or your supplemental essay, because they could ask about it, and you want to be able to speak truthfully and sincerely about those experiences and how they helped you. So just go back and look at that and take some notes, or just run through it in your brain on your way there so that you can be prepared for it. All right, so the final thing that you should really do to prepare yourself for your interview is practice. I know it can be so awkward, and just interviews in general are just so nerve-wracking. Help make yourself more comfortable by practicing beforehand. And you can do that in a variety of ways. For me, it looked like I had Sam pull up some sample questions on his phone, and he would randomly ask me the different questions. And after each question, he would give me a review, like, hey, you weren't really smiling at all during that, so maybe change your facial expressions. Or, hey, that response got to be about 5 minutes, and I was really bored by the end of it, and you were just kind of repeating yourself. So maybe try and actively not repeat yourself every time you reply to a question. So getting that feedback from a real live person was really helpful to me, because then when I went into my interviews, I'd already done a little bit of practice, or I'd already answered a certain question, and I felt a little bit more prepared. Now, if you don't have someone to help you do that, you can always look in a mirror or record yourself so that you can then go back and listen to your responses and give your own critiques. What I will say is that that feedback is really important because that's what helps you learn. So whether you're recording yourself or working with someone else, make sure to get the feedback so that you can incorporate it into your next response. The one thing that I do want to point out about practice is you're not practicing to memorize, you're practicing to familiarize. So build up a little library in your head of the stories that you're going to tell, but don't memorize it word for word, because when you get into an interview, if you're reciting something, they're going to know. But if you're speaking from the heart, then that makes it that much better of an interview. So in my case, when we practiced questions, it was kind of like stockpiling things in my head, like, oh, yes, that's the example of conflict I should use, or that's a really good example of teamwork, or that was a really good phrasing of the story of why I wanted to go into medicine. I should remember that. And it's not a memorization, it's being able to pull that file folder up real quick and be like, oh yes, it's this story, go tell that story. All right, hopefully that made sense, but in summary, familiarize, don't memorize. All right, so here's the last thing I'll say about just preparing for your interviews in general. You can do all the research that you want, you can practice all you want, but if you get that interview, celebrate. Celebrate, because that's a really big deal in the admissions process. Something that all of the admissions advisors told me, or told the group when we got to that interview day, is you are here because we know you can succeed in medical school. If they invite you to the interview, they know that you will be a good medical student and you have what it takes to become a doctor. They just want to see if you're going to be a good fit for the school. So if you get that interview, guess what? You have what it takes, and someone saw that in you. Someone saw your potential and they're like, that's awesome, we want to learn more. And if you don't get an acceptance after the interview, just know it's not because they don't think you're going to make a great doctor, or it's not because they don't think that you're going to make it in medicine. It's just, we don't think that you are the best fit for our school. If you get an interview, make sure you prepare and do your research so that you can go in feeling comfortable and ready. But just know that that's a really, really big accomplishment, and that's something to celebrate no matter what happens after the interview, okay? All right, so that was kind of my little download on how to prepare for your interview. That was definitely how I prepared. It wasn't anything super strenuous, just making sure you do your research and practice. So if there's anything else that you want to learn more about as it relates to interviews, please let me know in the comments below. I have a few more videos that I'm going to be sharing around interviews and ultimately making decisions on where to go to medical school, but I'd love to get your thoughts on other areas that I can speak to. So anyway, that's it for today. Thanks so much for watching. Make sure you subscribe and like this video because it really supports my channel, and I will see you next time. Bye!